Hi, guys. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Tuesday, June 2nd. Holy moly, time is absolutely flying. We are almost done with the school year, guys. I can't believe it. It's insane. I feel like the month of March was like a drag, and then April was slow, and then May happened and it was gone. And now it's June 2nd. So it's crazy, guys. We are, like I said, we are so close to the end of the school year, only a couple more lessons left. Like I said, I'm going to try. I really, really hope, guys, that these videos are helping you. I'm really doing my best here. I know you guys are absolutely doing your best. I'm doing my best just to get you as much information as possible to try to make it as realistic as possible, like we're in class. So I really hope you're enjoying the videos. I'm going to try to finish the year, like I said, with, for the most part, videos. And after this one, we'll probably have two, maybe three more at the most. Then we'll do some sort of a review for the Civil War. Then we'll do our big assessment on it. It'll be your second test of the fourth marking period. And that'll be it, guys. You'll walk your way into the summer, hopefully with an A or with an awesome grade. A passing grade obviously is what we want. But, just keep doing your thing. I will get back to you guys about like when the last day of instruction is. I'm not positive. I've heard a couple different things, so I will confirm with you guys. I've heard the 12th. I've heard, if we look at the calendar here, I've heard the 12th. I've also heard the 18th. Obviously, there's no finals this year, like we talked about. So, with no finals, they might be extending. So, I will confirm and I will get back to you guys for sure. But let's keep on rolling on this American Civil War. We're almost halfway through the content. We're not necessarily halfway through the Civil War, but we're about halfway through the content that we need to cover here. So, just a flyby review, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a time that truly divided our nation. And the more I see these protests and these riots going on right now in our country in 2020, we're living through absolutely insane times right now. And there's a time and a place for us to discuss our sides and our feelings about it. I might ask you a question about it, but that divide that our country is feeling now, although it seems like most people are in agreement and together, but the general divide across America right now is very similar to that divide during the Civil War, where there's two different sides, there's two different groups of people with two, really, really different and unique beliefs. And it feels like you're a nation that's broken. And that's kind of how life was during the Civil War, where things were broken, just kind of like they seem to be today in society, and where there's obviously people trying to fix it. And there's, sweeping big movements and changes and protests and riots. And obviously, in this case here, there's a war going on to try to change the divide in America, to try to, I guess you could say, fix it if you're the North, right? To try to sew the Union back together. So we talked about all the causes and the last attempts at compromise. The fall of Fort Sumter, how difficult it was for people to choose sides. So the North had more people, and some other advantages like railroads and a navy. And the South had a couple advantages as well. I'm just trying to remind you guys really quickly here. The first Battle of Bull Run, which was a big one, which was really great. We did this last class, I believe. Um, Started great for the North, but then eventually the South, with their superior military leadership, Stonewall Jackson. You had, let's see who else, a couple other, really, really important leaders here, basically taking over and winning this first Battle of Bull Run here. Again, it made the North a little bit intimidated, and it's kind of scared them a little bit. And they felt a little bit shameful here at the first Battle of Bull Run, whereas the South, the Confederacy, was excited, and it might have lulled them into a false security of, or a false sense of security. They're like, wow, this war is going to be easy. We got this. But nonetheless, the first battle was at Bull Run, where the North, the Union tried to reach Richmond, Virginia. They didn't get there. They went to Manassas. Here are a couple of the generals we have discussed. And then the general war strategies was one of the last things that we did on, I think it was on Friday, where the North wants to capture the capital. They want to get access to the Mississippi River, and they want to have that Anaconda plan where they totally separate and restrict the South and surround them and slowly bleed them out. So that was the North strategy. And the South strategy was basically to go north, capture the capital there, get the Shenandoah Valley, which would give them access to Maryland and to Pennsylvania, shatter their morale, get European support, which we know they didn't wind up getting. But those are some of the strategies here, okay? So today, let's dive in. We're actually going to talk about the military experience. We're not going to go crazy talking about specific battles. We're not going to do timelines of battles. I want, when we're discussing and reviewing the Civil War, I want you guys to feel like you know what it's like to live through it. Not the pain and the suffering, but I want you guys to get the experience. What was it actually like? We can go on and on. There were tons and tons of battles and major events. Obviously, we'll talk about Gettysburg and the Emancipation Proclamation, some of these huge events during the Civil War. But I think the best way to learn about history always is just like to feel it. Like what were these people experiencing on a daily basis? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the military experience here. So as we discussed at that first Battle of Bull Run, a lot of these soldiers were untrained. They were like clueless in terms of the battlefield, in terms of strategies, in terms of even military verbiage and terms used and call outs on the battlefield. And a lot of them were scared and nervous. So this new training was used. It's been called a lot through history trickle down training. It's actually what happened during the American Revolutionary War as well. It's basically where you have these highly trained officers, especially in the South, especially in the Confederacy, these really well trained officers from, you have guys like Robert E. Lee. You have in the North, obviously, Grant, and then you have Joseph Johnston, and you have McDowell, and all these phenomenal leaders. They would take a select, we'll call it 50 or 100 people. And they would train them. They would drill them for, a couple of days. They would teach them everything they know. They would pour their knowledge out on them, give them these books, these guides, these terms. They would walk them through grapple training and shooting and commanding officers. And then they would, basically do like a little question and a question answer type of segment where they would just have discussions. So then you have basically your greatest military mind of your army training 100 people. And then I'm sure you could guess what the trickle down effect means. Those 100 people now would be considered experts, and they would be majors or colonels or lieutenants or what have you, ranks in the army. And they would then train 100 people under them. And then it would just go on and on until basically everybody in your army was trained. Okay, so eventually it's almost like a game of telephone where I'm sure some information is lost, like that person on the third rung or the third level, I guess you could say, or fourth level of this trickle down training might not get the same training as the first one does, but it's a lot easier personalized training than having 50,000 people in a field with one commanding officer. So it was really cool that this is what they did. These high level officers, many of these people were really enthusiastic. That would be like as if picture us in a classroom and I was training you guys, I don't know, to be a teacher. That'd be pretty cool. I trained 25 of you guys in a classroom to be a teacher for a full year. And then you guys went and trained other people. I think that would be more effective than having, 5,000 people in the room. Okay. So that's what a lot of the training was like. Just like any war, lots of shortages of clothing, of food, of rifles, of coats, of shoes, of basically everything that you could think of. The Civil War was a really tough time. Obviously, a lot of people, during this time basically farm their own food. A lot of people, a lot of them, obviously there's no stores, there's no massive markets to get your food, to get your clothing at. So a lot of people made their own things. So when they're away from home, that's really tough. That's challenging. So there were shortages of a lot of different things. A lot of rationing. It's that idea of total war, just like World War I and World War II is this idea of total war where everybody participates. It's not just these soldiers on the battlefield that are getting hit and getting, feeling the wrath of the war. It's every single person in the Union, in the Confederacy, even if you're neutral, everybody is feeling some effect of the war. That's the idea of total war. And the conditions at a lot of these camps was disgusting, unsanitary, terrible conditions. Disease spread very, very often. Food was spoiled. I mean, having meat or having something nutritious like a vegetable or a fruit, forget about it. These guys lived off basically carbohydrates, which sure, they do give you energy, but carbohydrates might not give you the best, nutrition, vitamins and nutrients that you need. So they lived off things like corn and beans, but malnutrition was very big. That's just basically when you're not getting enough, again, vitamins, and you're basically just eating the same food over and over again. Disease ran rampant in these camps. Whenever there was a surgery that had to happen, there was no anesthetics. There was no numbing of it. It would just be literally a guy on a hacksaw chopping your arm off. And amputations were very common. Sometimes if there was a bigger person, this is disgusting, and they needed to chop off, your leg from the thigh. There would be one of those saws where there'd be two people, one on each side of it, going back and forth, chopping. So no anesthetics, none of that stuff. So these are just some of the challenges. Being a soldier was really tough. I will never say that being a soldier is easy in 2020. God, those people are incredibly brave, and they are heroes to the fullest extent of the word. But being a soldier today, I want to word this properly, but I think there were more challenges to being a soldier in the Civil War than there might have been today. Okay, just with today, I think that soldiers typically eat pretty well, and they're pretty well fed, they're pretty well taken care of, and they live in decent camps. Whereas a lot of the Civil War, soldiers, again, you could see some of the conditions, unsanitary conditions. A lot of them brought clothes from home; they just wore whatever they happened to have. I wrote down some stuff over here. There was influenza, there was pneumonia, typhoid. Basically, the hospitals that they went to were no help. They had hospitals in the Civil War that were basically just tents that were set up with no medical supplies at all. It's almost like hospitals today, during that coronavirus, that they ran out of the respirators. So it's almost like some of those hospitals were relatively useless. So these are just some of the challenges that Civil War soldiers had to deal with. I mean, you could see that's a real picture on the right. Remember, this is one of the first wars that was actually widely photographed. I mean, there's not, millions of photographs available, but there's certainly some. A guy named Matthew Brady was a famous photographer at the time, but you can just see, the looks on some of their faces and the struggles that they went through during the war. And remember too, when you got wounded, a lot of these bullets wouldn't necessarily go through you and kill you right away. They would get into your body, break up into different, fragments, almost like a frag grenade, and they would blow up inside of you. And then you'd have, a dozen, however many little metal fragments wherever you got shot. So if you got shot here in the arm, they might spread the fragments, the little metal pieces might spread all throughout your arm, and they would amputate below the highest piece. So again, scary stuff for sure, and that would lead to infections and I read a statistic as well that actually disease, infections, that type of thing, not even from shooting, but just diseases and the filthiness of the camps, that killed more than double the amount that bullets killed in the war. So double the amount of people in the Civil War died just from infectious diseases, pneumonia, even during the winter's frostbite, things like that. So everything you can imagine. And we've talked about, I think recently, at least during the American Revolutionary War, when we covered that, prisoner of war camps. And that's a whole another, I guess, can of worms, you could say. But prisoner of war camps were absolutely miserable. I mean, they're certainly still in existence today. I mean, they've changed a lot. But, think about let's say you are a Union soldier or a Union leader and you win a battle and you've got in front of you, 1,000 Confederate soldiers standing there with their hands up, with their hands behind their heads saying, to do whatever you want. We're giving up. They didn't get to run away. Maybe you have some options as a Union leader there. You can kill them, which sometimes is against, rules of war. You don't want to just kill someone that's given up. You could try to get information from them. Obviously, you don't want to send them back and say, okay, you could go free. We're not going to harm you, because then that just, strengthens the opposite side. So many soldiers that were captured in battle were put in prisoner of war camps, which again, still do exist today. I've read accounts of prisoner of war camps, and I don't want to gross anybody out here, but, prisoner of war camps or areas in Afghanistan where American soldiers have been taken as basically hostages, and they will pretty much torture you and interrogate you and waterboard you. And I read something the other day that Afghani, leaders of these prisoner of war camps would use like those hand drills that like the ones that spin, and they would picture what you can do to a human body with that. And they would do that to American people until they got the information they needed, or just because it was fun to torture them. I'm not saying that people in the Civil War necessarily tortured for fun, but prisoner of war camps, you can imagine how awful and horrific that they were. They were filthy, definitely. I mean, worse conditions than even the regular camps. No food, disease all over the place. They were overcrowded. They were packed, and they would interrogate them and force them and scare them to giving information. They were basically starved to death unless they were luckily rescued. So a lot of people during the Civil War did deal with prisoner of war camps. But overall, with the military experience, a lot of the soldiers were lonely. I mean, I think a lot of people think, I used to think about this too. Like when soldiers or people go to war, like you have this vision. It's almost like a video game vision in your head where it's constant, like Call of Duty. Like they're constantly fighting. They're at battle 24 hours a day, and it's really not what war is like typically. War is there's a lot of downtime in wars, especially in the Civil War, where there is a lot of sitting around and standing, and you might march a couple miles a day, but there might be a battle once every 2 3 weeks where you're battling for 2 or 3 hours, and then for the most part you're training and you're just trying to stay healthy. But a lot of the soldiers were just bored, sitting around. You could see what they're doing at this table. A lot of them played cards, some of them played sports, some of them would gamble, they would ride horses, they would train. A lot of them took to writing, writing to their family members. But this is just to kind of show you that, life as a Civil War soldier, might seem glorified to some, but a lot of them, most of them, dealt with so many challenges that I cannot even consider, living through. I complain if I don't know. I'll complain. Oh, my coffee got cold, and I'll complain about that. Like that's the worst thing that could happen. And you look and see what these American heroes had to deal with, during the time of war, during the time of shaping our country. So, and a lot of them deserted. A lot of them just left. They were they were sick of it. They went home. No one's going to hold them to a gunpoint and say you have to stay here, although there were contracts. But what are you going to do? You're going to kill them, or are you going to let them walk away? So a lot of them deserted and left. Some of them sang and danced and did different activities, and there were prayer groups. I mean, everything you could think of here just to kind of pass the time and get their minds off the terrible bloodiness of the war. Okay. So that's the military experience. Now, there's a guy named Matthew Brady, like I talked about. He was one of the most famous photographers of of the Civil War. And he basically went around documenting the war. And there are some pictures that, are still circulating and clear. A lot of, thousands of his pictures are now gone. But, these are just a couple of these pictures are going to be from him, and you could see true, real pictures, real photographs of, life during the Civil War. It's just a camp. You could see it's overcrowded. You could see how many people are there, and you could see the challenging conditions. This is in color, so obviously this was not a real Civil War picture, but this is to show you basically the provisions. Provisions is what they called, like your food intake for the day. You guys watched in a video this cracker here was basically called hardtack. It was almost like a fire cake from the Revolutionary War, just flour and water, and that would be like they would stay good for a long time. They would get hard, but that's like what if you don't try this at home, but if you just eat bread with only made no flavor, none of that's no flavor, no cheese, no not even really much yeast in it. But if you just eat bread for like a week, your body will just start to break down and not feel right. There's really no nutrition in flour. It's just flour and water. So that's a lot of what they ate was hardtack. If they got lucky, they might have some beans or they might have some corn or some different things, but still those don't provide the most nutrition value. They do give you calories and fill your stomach up, but this is on the table here is basically what you would see being eaten during the Civil War. There's some, oh my gosh, here you go. Surgery time, right in the middle of the open, lay on a table. We're going to have one guy hold you down because this is going to be extremely painful for you. And, we're going to amputate you. We're going to try to pull that bullet out, but it might not work. They might, if they were lucky, they might have had a little bit of alcohol that they could give you to numb the pain. But that was really only saved for officers. Your regular, typical, soldier wouldn't get that treatment. So this is talk about struggling, right? Talk about heroes. These are the people here, going through surgery. That's a real photo. This was another hospital during the Civil War here. You could see it's crowded. You could see it looks like mayhem. Truthfully, I can't even really fully tell what's going on here, but a lot of action here. Looks like someone's getting worked on over here, but just brutal. If you weren't scared enough to go out and die, this seems even more scary to me, to get wounded and then come back and get treated like this. Not that they were treated poorly, but this was the best medical treatment that they had. This picture's a little blurry, so I'll pass it up. This was a real picture from one of the camps. People just kind of doing some recreation, hanging around. They look like they're sitting around, maybe singing, maybe playing some music, hanging out, relaxing. Again, a lot of downtime as a soldier. I personally don't have experience, obviously, but, even hear from some of my friends or people that I know that I'm familiar with, and I even follow a couple on Snapchat, like friends from college that are either overseas or stationed or in the armed forces now, and they do have a lot of downtime too. And I'm not saying they just sit there having a good time because they're working their damn butts off, but my point is here that there's a lot of downtime. When you're a soldier. There's one of the camps there. You could see obviously horses and buggies and carriages is how uh, intel got around, how supplies got around, and how people got around. So really trying to dive you guys in today to that Civil War experience in this war that's going to obviously change our country. And I think the title of this had to do with sorry, I dropped my water here. The title of this picture here had to do with I think young men, and there were basically young boys throughout the whole camp, and they would help out anywhere that they could. They would be like servants. There would be people as young as 5, 6, 7 years old, either cleaning or helping cooking or preparing meals or doing anything they can. And that's that idea of total war where everybody's there. Okay. And, you could see its impacts on society, mass impact, so many people involved. Okay. Okay. A couple more things. Let's talk about the home front here. So what was life like? We're talking about life in the Civil War, right? Well, what was life like if you weren't a soldier, if you weren't enlisted in the Army? Well, the North and South, obviously, they were similar. And the war was very glorified in the beginning. What does that mean? If I say the war was very glorified in the beginning? Well, since I can't call on anybody raising their hands, glorified just means like people pumped it up. Like they made it seem like it was awesome. And it was like they had like a romance with the war. And it was like, this is great. We're going to go win this quickly. And in the very beginning, people were so enthusiastic, so excited about the war. And that, as time went on, that slowly faded out. And as the war started to drag on and there were stalemates for months at a time, that romance and love and glorification of the war faded. But in the North, we had a lot of factories, like we have discussed, right? And women were forced to take those jobs in factories. Listen, if you were an able man, if you could hold a gun and you could point it and you could shoot it relatively straight, you were going to war, okay? I would have been at war. People your age probably would have been at war. Me, you might be slightly too young, but people up to, it wasn't like, 18 to 22-year-olds. Now, it was if you were an able individual, you could carry a rifle, you could walk, you could march, you're going to war if you're a man. Okay, so women had to step up big time. And there's so many times in history where we've seen women do absolutely amazing things. Especially today, but many women stepped up. They worked in factories. They took over the northern factories. They worked in arsenals to provide weapons and munitions, sewing rooms for shirts and for uniforms. Remember, a lot of these soldiers wore their own clothes from home. Like I would just be wearing this hoodie if I went to go fight. There weren't uniforms across the board, right? Because there's no money for that. There's no money for food, so forget money for uniforms, right? The first women actually started to work in the treasury, so women really stepped up. Other women worked as bankers, morticians. Unfortunately, the job of a mortician, running funeral homes or funeral parlors, that type of stuff, digging up graves, that was more prominent during the Civil War, whereas millions were dying. Hundreds of thousands were dying in America. So morticians became more rampant, I guess you could say. Some women worked as steamboat captains. So, people stepping up all over the place, especially in the North. And there were volunteers, there were committees that raised money, that did fundraisers, that, they made their own bandages. They would be like parties, like, hey, you want to come over tonight and make some homemade bandages or make some bedcloths or make some shirts or make some clothing, and we're going to send them out. That would be like the idea of fun for some families and groups of people during the Civil War, that they could help their family members, their friends, their loved ones who were out fighting. Okay. The South was similar, but again, they didn't have as many factories or necessarily arsenals. Obviously, they had some arsenals, but they weren't as, I guess you could say, established in terms of buildings and locations and things like that. It was more land, but the South was very prideful in the beginning, especially after that first Battle of Bull Run or the Battle of Manassas. There were parades, there were barbecues, there were raffles, there was big, huge parties, basically to spread support. Auctions were very, very common. And, rampant support, for friends and family all over the South. They did even hold at, some of these rallies, they held these like parties. They called them starvation parties. I would never want to go to it, but it was basically these parties where people would gather together, and the only thing that they served was water. There would be no food, and there would be people that like legitimately starve themselves for a couple days so that they could sacrifice their own food so that they could ship their food out, their whatever they would eat for 2 or 3 days. They would just not eat, have a starvation party with their friends, and then take all that food and send it to the soldiers. So it shows you, how much people on the home front were affected during the war. Imagine going to a starvation party. No thanks. The first thing I do when I walk into a party is look and see what chips are out and what soda I can drink and whatnot. And I don't think I would do so well at one of these starvation parties. But it shows you the sacrifices that people made and how passionate people were about winning the Civil War and about helping their loved ones and their families and their friends and so on. Again, we talked about what people lived off: bean, corns, potatoes. And then eventually this last bullet point here goes for both the North and the South. The Union and the Confederacy. The romance with the war slowly started to fade. You have huge food shortages. Inflation was a big issue that the South had to deal with, especially if we went back because of the Anaconda Plan. So the South was actually not able to really get goods and items and trade with Europe. That was their market, right? That's how they made money. That's what sparked their economy. Now with the Anaconda Plan, now that the South was surrounded, they weren't able to do that. So they're not making money. Their economy's poor. Inflation goes crazy. And then a lot of people, grieving for their dead friends and family and so on and so forth. So, life on the home front, as we just learned here, was definitely, maybe not as challenging as being at war in the military experience, but just wanted to show you guys some of those challenges that everybody dealt with. It's not just the soldiers in the military experience, it's people on the home front as well. Okay. Hey, last thing, I'm going to show you a couple more pictures, and then we'll do just some civilian aid on the battlefield, and then we'll be done for the day. There's just some women working in a factory. This was a Matthew Brady photograph here. Women sewing, doing everything that they could to help out. These are some Confederate women. Some, not in this picture, but some women dressed as men just so that they can enlist. Remember, this was still a time where women didn't have a right to vote yet, not till 1919, 1920. So they had, about another 60 years till that happened. So they couldn't really enlist, but some of them dressed up as men to fight. These women look like they're, I don't really have a description for this one, but they just look like they were standing in front of possibly a Confederate flag. And these were just some supporters of the Confederacy. Overall supporters of the war. These are some of the people that might have helped out or had those starvation parties or what have you. This is actually a starvation party. If I was starving, I would want to sit and do absolutely nothing. But just to pass the time, they would party and they would sing and dance like we discussed earlier. If I was starving, I would just want to like lay in bed. But different times we're in, huh? These are just some soldiers passing the time, either playing some cards. They made a little homemade table there with a plank of wood and some tree stumps, hanging out. That's a typical uniform with the hats and you could typically see a lot of buttons there. Okay, and last but not least here, some civilian aid, actually on the battlefield here, not just in the home front. Some women, like we discussed, they dressed like men because they wanted to fight. There were actually a lot more people than you would think in the United States at the time that remained neutral. And they basically vowed to, no matter what, help both sides. And these people, these neutral people, I forget exactly what it was. There were like flags that they could fly outside their house. There were symbols that they could use to put outside their homes to show that they were neutral. And some people might not have liked it. Like if you're a neutral person living in the North, your northern neighbors that support the Union and love the Union might say, what are you doing? Why are you neutral? Or it might be vice versa in the South or whatever. But these neutral people were supposed to be like off limits. You weren't supposed to touch them, leave them alone. They want to stay neutral. It's fine. And many of these neutral people worked in either churches. Some of them were nuns, and they would basically have their doors open at all times. They would say, come in anytime you want. I will help you. I will get, if a battalion or an infantry walked by, they would say, I'll help you with, I'll give you food. I could help you in terms of giving you bandages, doing whatever I can. So a lot of people did remain neutral. But again, this was definitely a time in America for choosing sides and figuring out what side you're going to support. There was a decent amount of neutrality, but I'm not talking like 5 or 10% of the population. You might talk about 1% of the population, but again, 1% of a couple million, still a lot of people, remaining neutral in the war. Okay. There was a committee created during this time, the UN Sanitary Commission. It was to fight against diseases, infections, things like that. And they also worked for both sides, the Union and the Confederacy. And they were trying to figure out a way, how can we prolong the lives of people that are at war and are not being shot and killed? How can we prevent deaths from malaria, from typhoid, from all these diseases and from these infections? Because once again, as stated before, infections and disease kill double the amount of soldiers that bullets actually did. So that's a scary thing to think about. Okay. And just a little fun fact here. This woman here, Clara Barton, great American hero. She created the American Red Cross, which is a great American organization now that aids people in need. She created it during the Civil War. So pretty cool fact there for you, Clara Barton. Okay. And last picture of the day. This is just some people from that commission that I talked about earlier, the U.S. Sanitary Commission. They just look like kind of normal people. You can get a glimpse of what, the styles and what the facial hair and what the culture looked like during the Civil War. It's I like to teach through pictures and through primary sources because I think that's the coolest way to learn. But hope you guys learned a lot today. I miss you so much, but to go over it, right, we did basically 3 things. We talked about the military experience and what it was like to be a soldier during the Civil War. And we discussed the home fronts, what life was like at home. And then we did civilian aid on the battlefield. So I'm hoping that you guys learned a lot just about the Civil War experience itself. Next class, we'll get into some of the more significant battles. We'll talk about how everybody didn't actually support the war. There was some opposition to the war. It wasn't everybody that in the country that supported it. So we'll discuss that. We'll talk about some battles, and we'll progress. We'll get into 1862, 1863, eventually to the Gettysburg Address. And again, 2 or 3 more videos, guys, and this is going to be it for the year. So take care of the questions. Hope you have an amazing day. Check your grades. Stay strong, and I will see you guys again on Thursday. Okay? Take care, guys. Bye.